The large wooden doors of the church of St. Lancian were already open, letting in the biting chill of an early Italian morning. It was the 8th century in the small, quiet town of Lanciano, a place where life was dictated by the rising sun and ringing bells. Inside, the shadows were long, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and old incense. For most of the townspeople, this was a refuge. But for one man standing near the altar, the church had slowly become a prison of his own making. He was a Basilian monk who had given his entire existence to the church. From the outside, he was exactly what the people needed. He was a scholar and a shepherd who guided his flock through brutal hardships. When he spoke, people listened. When he offered blessings, people felt comforted. But beneath the heavy folds of his dark monastic habit, he carried a secret tearing him apart. He was losing his faith. This was not a sudden crisis. It was a slow, agonizing erosion that had been happening for months, perhaps years. Every morning, as he prepared for daily rituals, a heavy silence seemed to press down on his chest. He would look at the ancient texts, the lit candles, the sacred vessels, and a terrifying emptiness would wash over him. The very foundation of his life, the belief that God was truly present in the world, and most specifically upon the altar, was slipping through his fingers like dry sand. He felt like an imposter. The guilt was overwhelming. How could he continue to stand before the faithful, day after day, asking them to believe in a mystery that he himself was struggling to accept? On this particular morning, the burden had become almost too much to bear. As he walked slowly toward the altar to begin the Mass, his hands were trembling. The stone floor felt colder than usual beneath his feet. He looked out at the small gathering of faithful townspeople who had braved the early morning cold to be there. They were hardworking people. They carried their own deep sorrows, grief for lost children, fear of the coming winter, the quiet desperation of simply trying to survive. They had come to this church seeking a sliver of hope, a connection to something divine, and they were relying on him to bridge that gap. Before he began the ancient Latin prayers, he closed his eyes, bowed his head, and offered a desperate, silent plea. He did not ask for theological clarity. He did not ask for historical proof. He simply prayed for a sign. A single, undeniable thread of truth that he could hold on to before he completely fell into the abyss of his own doubt. The Mass proceeded exactly as it had 1,000 times before. He chanted the familiar words, his voice echoing softly against the high stone ceiling. Every movement was muscle memory. He washed his hands. He prepared the altar. He took the simple, round wafer of unleavened bread into his hands. He took the chalice of wine, but his mind was entirely elsewhere, trapped in the suffocating darkness of his internal conflict. Then came the moment of consecration, the most solemn part of the ritual, the exact moment he had spent the last several months doubting more than anything else. He leaned over the altar, his voice barely a whisper, and spoke the ancient words of institution. As the syllables left his lips, something strange happened. It was not a loud noise. It was not a flash of light. It was a sudden, physical resistance in his hands. He looked down at the host he was holding. The bread was no longer dry. The texture was changing right beneath his fingertips. A deep, unmistakable red began to spread across the center, blooming outward like a dark, heavy stain. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped back, nearly knocking over the chalice. The liquid inside the cup was no longer the thin, clear wine he had poured just moments before. It was thick, It was coagulating. He stood frozen, heart pounding violently in his chest, completely unable to comprehend what his own eyes were forcing him to see. The silence in the church suddenly felt heavier than it ever had in his entire life. The profound silence inside the church of St. Lanciano was no longer peaceful. It was completely paralyzing. For what felt like an eternity, the Basilian monk stood absolutely rigid before the stone altar, unable to tear his eyes away from the corporal cloth spread before him. His hands hovered in the air, trembling violently. The thin, unleavened bread he had just held was gone. In its place rested a piece of real, physical tissue. It possessed the undeniable, raw texture of human flesh. The chalice beside it held a substance that defied all reason. It was no longer liquid wine. It had thickened, pooling into dark, heavy clots of blood. Behind him, the small congregation of early morning worshippers remained kneeling on the cold stone floor. But as the seconds ticked by, turning into heavy minutes, a subtle wave of unease began to ripple through the church. People exchanged confused glances. Why had he stopped? Was he ill? An elderly woman in the front row was the first to realize that something profound was happening. She heard a desperate gasp escape from his throat and saw his shoulders shaking violently beneath his heavy robes. Slowly, almost as if fighting an invisible physical force, the priest turned to face the people. His face was entirely drained of color. He could not speak. The carefully memorized Latin phrases that had anchored his entire adult life completely failed him. Instead, he simply extended his trembling hands, stepping slightly aside so the pale morning light from the high window could illuminate the altar. He did not need to say a word. The townspeople of Lanciano recognized immediately what they were looking at. A collective gasp echoed against the stone walls. Men and women accustomed to harsh realities fell forward, pressing their faces to the floor in absolute awe. The priest, who had quietly begged God for a single thread of truth to anchor his failing faith, had just been handed something so physically overwhelming that it shattered his reality. To understand the sheer magnitude of this moment, one must understand the exact world in which this priest lived. It was the 8th century, a time of massive upheaval and bitter division within the Christian world. This particular monk belonged to the order of St. Basil. He and his brothers were not originally from this quiet part of Italy. They were Greek monks, refugees who had fled the Byzantine Empire to escape a violent movement known as iconoclasm. In the East, a brutal persecution had begun against physical representations of the divine. These Basilian monks had been forced to abandon their homeland, carrying the trauma of a fractured church. But the ideological poison of the time, the questioning of how the spiritual world could truly interact with the physical world, had followed them. It was this exact intellectual and spiritual crisis that had quietly infected the priest's mind. He had been drowning in these theological debates, questioning if the physical bread and wine could truly become divine, or if it was merely an empty symbol in a broken world. Now he was tasked with an impossible reality. The Mass ended not in a structured dismissal, but in a state of chaotic reverence. The townspeople rushed out into the cold morning air to spread the unimaginable news. By nightfall, the quiet church of St. Lanciano was surrounded. The people demanded to witness the impossible. But as the adrenaline of the morning faded, a new, terrifying conflict began to take root in the minds of the monks. If this was truly human flesh and human blood, the natural laws of the world dictated what must happen next. Without preservation, without modern science, the flesh would inevitably begin to decompose. The blood would spoil. They carefully secured the sacred elements, placing them in a simple, temporary ivory vessel, terrified of what the coming days would bring. The priest who had prayed for a sign now found himself burdened with a suffocating fear. What if the sign rotted away? What if it decayed into dust, leaving him with deeper doubts? The monks watched the altar, unprepared for the reality that the physical evidence would completely refuse to follow the natural laws of decomposition. The true mystery of Lanciano was only just beginning. The fear of the Basilian monks in the days following the event was completely justified by the natural world. Organic matter, left exposed to the air without the careful mummification processes of the ancient world, is destined for ruin. They placed the transformed bread and wine into a simple ivory container, fully expecting that time would slowly erase the terrifying thing they had witnessed. But days turned into weeks, and years into entire centuries. The flesh did not rot. The blood did not spoil. Instead, the physical elements settled into a permanent state that defied all biological logic. As the centuries passed, the quiet town of Lanciano became a beacon for pilgrims. The church changed hands, eventually falling under the care of the Franciscan order. To preserve the flesh, which had begun to curl at the edges as it dried, it was gently pinned to a wooden board, leaving it permanently in the shape of a hollow ring. The blood dried into 5 distinct, irregularly shaped pellets. For hundreds of years, the faithful came to look upon this ancient mystery. But as the medieval world gave way to the modern era of science and skepticism, the relic faced a new kind of scrutiny. The Church itself is inherently cautious regarding claims of the miraculous. By the 20th century, human understanding of biology, anatomy, and cellular decay had advanced to a point where ancient legends could be definitively tested. Was this truly a miracle, or was it a pious medieval forgery? Had someone simply replaced the elements with animal tissue centuries ago? In November of 1970, the Archbishop of Lanciano, with the full backing of the Vatican, made a bold decision. He authorized a rigorous, unprecedented scientific examination of the ancient relics. They called upon Dr. Odoardo Linoli, a distinguished professor in anatomy and pathological histology. He was assisted by Dr. Ruggero Bertelli, a professor emeritus of anatomy at the University of Siena. The scientists approached the task with strict objectivity. They removed the ancient glass panels. They extracted minuscule samples from the dried ring of flesh and took fragments from the coagulated pellets of blood. Linoli took these samples back to his laboratory, subjecting them to a battery of intense microscopic and chemical analyses. For months, the relic that had anchored the faith of a doubting 8th century monk was placed under the unforgiving lens of modern empirical science. What Dr. Linoli discovered sent shockwaves through the scientific and religious communities. When he finally presented his findings in 1971, his report read like a biological impossibility. First, the flesh was definitively human, but it was not just a random piece of muscle tissue sliced from a body. Under the microscope, the cellular structure was unmistakable. It was striated muscular tissue of the myocardium. It was a complete cross-sectional slice of a human heart, specifically containing the left ventricle, arteries, and the vagus nerve. The priest had not just held flesh. He had been holding a human heart. Second, the blood was unquestionably human blood. Furthermore, immunological tests quickly revealed its specific blood group, type AB. Intriguingly, this is the exact same rare blood type found on the Shroud of Turin, another of Christianity's most intensely studied historical artifacts. But the most staggering revelation of the investigation was what the scientists did not find. If this tissue had been preserved by human hands in the 8th century, there would have been traces of chemical agents. Ancient embalmers used salts, resins, and various compounds to halt decomposition. Linoli's exhaustive chemical analysis found absolutely no trace of any preservatives. The proteins in the blood were normally fractionated, existing in the exact same percentage as those found in the fresh blood of a living human being. The scientific conclusion was stark and unavoidable. A piece of a human heart and 5 clots of human blood had been left exposed to the atmosphere, to biological agents, and to the varying temperatures of central Italy for over 1,200 years. According to every known law of science, they should have disintegrated into dust a millennium ago. Yet, they remained intact. The 8th century priest had begged for a sign to anchor his faith, and modern science, 12 centuries later, had just proven that the sign he received was biologically real. The findings of Dr. Odoardo Linoli were not kept hidden in a dusty Vatican archive. They were published, peer-reviewed, and subjected to the intense scrutiny of the World Health Organization a few years later. The WHO appointed a medical commission that conducted hundreds of individual tests over a period of 15 months. Their final report, spanning thousands of words, completely corroborated Linoli's findings. Science, operating entirely within its own strict empirical boundaries, had arrived at a conclusion that it could not naturally explain. The flesh was living tissue. The blood was real. 12 centuries of exposure had not corrupted what happened on that altar. But while the scientific data is astonishing, the true weight of the miracle of Lanciano is not found in a laboratory. It is found in the deeply human struggle of the man who started it all. We do not even know his name. History only remembers him as a Basilian monk who was losing his grip on his vocation. And perhaps that anonymity is intentional, because in his profound, suffocating doubt, he represents all of us. Faith is rarely a simple, unbroken path of absolute certainty. For most people, it is a daily choice made in the face of suffering, silence, and the harsh realities of the physical world. The priest in Lanciano was surrounded by a community of hardworking, exhausted people who looked to him for spiritual strength. He felt like a hypocrite because he was preaching a mystery that his own mind could no longer comprehend. He was standing on the edge of a spiritual abyss, ready to surrender to the terrifying thought that perhaps the altar was empty, that perhaps the bread was just bread, and that the heavens were entirely silent. He did not ask for a public spectacle. He did not ask for a weapon to use against theological opponents. In a moment of sheer desperation, he simply asked a silent, internal question. Are you really here? The Catholic Church teaches that the Eucharist is not a symbol. It is not a metaphor or a mere communal meal. The doctrine of transubstantiation holds that at the moment of consecration, the bread and wine truly become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. Usually, this profound reality remains hidden beneath the veil of ordinary food. It requires an immense leap of faith. The physical senses perceive dry bread, but the soul is asked to recognize the Creator of the universe. But on that cold morning in the 8th century, God chose to strip away the veil. In an act of radical, intimate mercy, he responded to the quiet agony of a doubting priest by allowing the physical reality of the sacrament to become visible. And what is most striking is exactly what was revealed. It was not just random human tissue. It was a cross-section of a heart. Specifically, the myocardium, the muscular wall of the heart that pumps life-giving blood to the rest of the body. The theological implications are staggering. God did not just provide scientific proof of his presence. He provided his very heart. It is a profound physical manifestation of the core message of Christianity. A God who loves humanity with a vulnerable, physical, beating heart. The same heart that bled on a wooden cross in Jerusalem was placed into the trembling hands of a doubting monk in Italy. Today, the small town of Lanciano remains a quiet, unassuming place. But inside the Church of San Francesco, resting inside a silver ostensorium, the ancient flesh and the 5 pellets of coagulated blood are still visible. They have survived the fall of empires, the ravages of the plague, devastating world wars, and the dawn of the atomic age. They stand as a silent, unyielding witness to a reality that transcends time and defies natural law. The miracle of Lanciano reminds us that doubt is not the end of faith. Sometimes, it is the exact place where God chooses to intervene most powerfully. The priest who thought his spiritual life was completely over became the vessel for a mystery that would anchor the faith of millions for over 1,000 years. He asked for a single thread of truth, and he was handed the very heart of the divine. If this story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment where a deep doubt was answered in an unexpected way? And if you enjoy discovering the lesser-known stories, mysteries, and profound lessons of Catholic history, please subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories still waiting to be uncovered.